first of all, very grateful to be back in Xalapa. I've enjoyed working here for the last decade or so. And 4 years ago, I gave a conference about this set of issues, and I gave a warning at the beginning of that conference, which I would like to repeat at this point. I'm an economist, and economists have successfully projected 11 of the last 3 recessions. So we aren't very good at predicting things. So I'm going to talk about the process of electing a president today, and I'm going to give you my thoughts about where the process is right now. But unlike 4 years ago, this is a very uncertain electoral climate. So you need to take any projections that I give you with a grain of salt. How did Barack Obama get elected president? The simplest answer is he got the most votes, but there's a more complex one. Number one, there was a large discontent in a lot of the American population with George W. Bush. Conservatives were worried that he was spending too much money. Liberals were concerned about his international policy and about his conservative social values. So anybody who ran against a Democratic candidate in 2006 any Republican candidate would have a hard time getting through that process. Add to that a feeling that the U.S. Congress was not doing its job. In the 2006 election, 9% of the American people thought Congress was doing a good job. 9%. So that hurt any Republican candidate because the Republicans controlled Congress. Third factor was that there was at least one perception that the financial crisis, which began in 2008, the financial crisis was caused by Wall Street. Now, there's a lot of thinking on the other side that the financial crisis was caused by banking decisions and government decisions, but at least the popular perception in 2008 was that Wall Street caused the problem. And last but not least, Barack Obama got elected because he was the first African American to be a serious candidate for president. And a lot of Americans wanted to have an African American president. The 2010 elections came, and it looked like Americans turned radically the other way. So the 3 leaders of the Democratic Party, who were Barack Obama, the president, Harry Reid, who was the head of the U.S. Senate, and Nancy Pelosi, who was the head of the House of Representatives, had gone too far. There were worries about the deficit. The deficit at that time had grown by $5 trillion. And there was a concern that the stimulus, where the president spent $1.7 billion, didn't work. That we didn't reduce unemployment, that we didn't improve the economic situation substantially. Now, I've presented a chart of several economic indicators, and I want to only highlight a couple of them. Because, in fact, the perception about how things are going is changing. We'll talk about that in a minute. The perception on unemployment was that this was the worst group of unemployment since the Great Depression in the 1930s. We had a large number of people unemployed. And there is still concern that even with the slightly improving both economic growth and unemployment numbers, that there are still a lot of people who are not participating in the economy. So you had one election in 2008 where the Democrats won very big. And then you had one election in 2010 where the Republicans took back all those gains almost at once. Now, what I would like to do is explain the American political process because it's very different than the Mexican process. Okay? So I've given you 5 or 6 things that we ought to talk about. Number 1, from now until about June, both the Republican and the Democratic Party are holding 2 kinds of events in each of the 50 states. They're holding things called primaries, which are just like elections, except you can only vote for candidates of your own party. And then they hold caucuses. And caucuses are meetings of the parties to talk about who the candidate should be selected. In some states they have caucuses, in some states they have primaries. And that will go on. The largest one that you want to watch for is March the 6th, which is called Super Tuesday. And there, a number of states will have primary election votes all at once. Now, second thing that you want to learn something about is something called super PACs, super political action committees. And pursuant to a Supreme Court decision of several years ago called Citizens United, private citizens can put together fundraising organizations called super PACs, and as long as they aren't tied directly to a political candidate, they can raise and expend money trying to influence an election. My guess is that in this election cycle, the super PACs will raise as much as the parties raise. And they are supposed to be independent of the candidates. In late summer, the 2 political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, will meet in a convention. And they will choose their candidate for president. And then about the 1st of September, in what in America is called Labor Day, you will begin a campaign that will run until the first Tuesday in November. That's election day. Now there's one other wrinkle in the American process that isn't true in the Mexican process. We have something called the Electoral College. When I vote for president in November, ultimately who I will be voting for is not either Barack Obama or his opponent. I will be voting for a slate of delegates that are pledged to vote for that candidate. California has 54 electoral votes in the electoral college. There are 535 electoral votes. And to win majority, a presidential candidate needs to get 270 electoral votes. Okay? So it's not exactly a direct election. In the 2000 election, because George Bush was declared the winner in Florida, even though he lost the popular vote, he won the presidency because of the rules of our Constitution. Okay? And then last thing that happens is you have the inauguration in January. So like the Mexican election that you'll have in July, and the inauguration that comes, I think, is it December, is that right? Okay, December the 1st. Ultimately, we wait a little bit after the election. Now I'm going to talk about 5 things that this president has to think about in this electoral cycle. Ultimately, any election is determined on how the American people feel about the incumbent versus his opponent. In the Mexican election this time we could say her opponent, but in the U.S. we still can't say that. Okay? So number 1, this is a picture of the deficits that this administration has run since the Obama administration was inaugurated. The red lines here, this is balanced budget. This is the last Bush budget, and these are the deficits. And if you look at the budget that the president just announced, what happens is these red lines grow longer. So he adds $11 trillion more in debt in the United States. This is a comparison of our debt right now versus the gross domestic product. This is basically World War II, and this is where we are right now. And if you look at the estimates after the president's budget proposal, these numbers actually go up, but we are at historically high levels. The United States is not Greece right now, but it's very close in the amount of debt that it has incurred from President Bush and from President Obama, but mostly from President Obama. Issue number 2. This is a very complicated chart, so let me simplify it. Okay? All those lines there are various recessions that we've had over the last several decades. This is the current recession, and you notice that it has been deeper and longer than any recession prior. And look at 1981, 1980 right here, and 1981. Look at how much faster those things came up. The argument that is being made at this point is that the stimulus, which was designed to bring us out of this problem, has not been successful. Okay? Now, one other thing that you have to think about in the U.S., there are 2 numbers related to employment. Number 1 is the issue of unemployment, and that's essentially people who are seeking to find a job that don't have one. But the second thing that economists like me look at is labor market participation. And labor market participation, in my mind, is more important. Labor market participation is taking all of the people who could work and dividing it by essentially dividing the number of people who are actually working right now, who are fully employed. When Barack Obama became President of the United States, the labor market participation rate in the U.S. was 65%. It is now 58%. If you counted unemployment, using the same labor market participation rate, our true unemployment rate would be almost 11%. No president, by the way, has ever gotten reelected with an unemployment rate over about 8.3%. This is number 3. One of the president's major initiatives was a health care plan to do national health care in the United States. It was a very contentious bill. It was passed without a single Republican vote. No major legislation in the history of the country has ever been passed without a bipartisan vote. So this is a very contentious issue, and it remains very, very unpopular. If you look at the people who support it, which is the black line, versus the people who oppose it, it consistently has had a spread between support and oppose of between 11 and 15%. Number 4, and I wanted to show you this slide because this is how the Electoral College actually works. Okay? The red states are states where President Obama's, at least this was 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, President Obama's popularity rating was negative. So it was well below 50%. And if you looked at all those states, the large states, like the one I live in California and Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, all of those states, are in favor of the president and have favorable ratings. The red states have negative ratings. And at least when this presentation was put together, the president's negative ratings, if those negative ratings turned into votes, he would lose the election at this point. We'll come back to that because it's changing. This is Presidential Approval Index. This is a week old, and to show you how fast things are moving, the last one, this is done by Rasmussen polling, which is the best poller for this kind of issue. The last one brought this number down to about -2. Okay, so the president's numbers are improving dramatically. Now here's number 5. Is the country going in the right direction or the wrong direction? There are 2 sets of polls that are done on this. This was taken only a little more than a week ago, and the New York Times poll actually said that now a majority of Americans feel the country is going in the right direction. I don't believe those numbers, but I think they've closed up a bit. But if you look at those numbers right now, no president would be reelected when 63% of the people in the country think the country is going in the wrong direction. So elections are always about, not just about who the candidate is, but who the opponents are. And I want to talk about the 4 opponents that the president could have. This first picture is of Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was the governor of Massachusetts. He ran the successful Salt Lake Olympics, and he was a venture capitalist with a company called Bain & Company. He was the Republican establishment's person of choice at the beginning of this election cycle. Okay? The concern about him, there are 2 sets of concerns. Some evangelical Christians are worried because he is a Mormon, and that may diminish the vote for him. And some conservative Republicans are worried that he is not a real Republican. So who are the other people? Then you got Ron Paul. Ron Paul is a physician and a member of Congress from Texas. He is a libertarian. And a lot of his economic philosophy, or much of his economic philosophy, is very important to Republicans. Except he gets a little extreme at times. For example, he wants to eliminate the Federal Reserve System. And that's a little bit off the mark. Plus, he is a fervent isolationist. So he believes that America ought to pull back from all its world responsibilities immediately. So, well, I think he has some interesting ideas. I think his chances of winning are very small. He could potentially be a third-party candidate. Third candidate is Rick Santorum. He was a congressman and then a two-term senator from the state of Pennsylvania. He is a social conservative and an economic conservative. Until a couple of weeks ago, he was an also-ran. But in the last couple of weeks, he has begun to show, he won 3 primaries about a week ago, and he is now Mitt Romney's major opponent. And then the last one, you have the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich is probably the brightest candidate who has run for president in recent years. He has a PhD, he was a college professor, but he also has a propensity to put his foot in his mouth, and he also has a propensity to not treat the women he is married to very well. So, for example, one of his wives, who had a serious incident with cancer, Mitt came into her and said, "I've got to get a divorce," right when she was having cancer. I suspect that not many women are going to be very supportive of Mitt. He also has a tendency to have temper tantrums. And I wrote in the blog that I do about a month ago that I didn't think he was temperamentally fit to be president of the United States. Now, here's some problems that I told you about the Obama problems. There are a lot of Obama problems, but let's talk about the GOP problems. Romney, we talked about the Mormon situation, which is troubling, at least to some voters. And there's a lot of concern that Wall Street, if it didn't cause the financial meltdown that we had in the U.S., certainly contributed to it very heavily. And Mitt Romney was part of it. Mitt Romney's other problem is that he has a tendency to put his foot in his mouth. So, for example, at the most important conservative political action committee last week, he described himself as a severe conservative. Now, I could say ardent, I could say excited, but severe is not exactly the right modifying word and he hasn't generated a lot of excitement. Nobody is really saying, I really want this guy to be president, as Obama was in 2008. Gingrich, his major problem is that he's impulsive. So if you look at his record over time, he comes up with big ideas. In 1994, he came up with something called the Contract for America. And the Contract for America was a great set of ideas that said, if you elect Republicans to Congress, I will guarantee that these 10 ideas will be enacted. And that was an idea-based election, and he's done that very well. And yet at the same time, he's impulsive negatively. So I think Gingrich will fade away pretty quickly. Paul's problem, in my mind, his major problem is some of his ideas are way outside the American mainstream of thinking, especially about isolationism. Now, Santorum is going to be portrayed, if he is a candidate, as a strange social conservative. And let me give you a story about Santorum that will give you something that will be part of the fodder if he is the candidate. Will be part of the discussion. Rick Santorum had a child who was born and who only lived a couple of hours. After the child was born and after the child died, he and his wife took the child out of the hospital and brought it home and essentially gave it, he's a devout Catholic, gave it last rites at home, gave the rest of the family, I think he has 7 children, the chance to see this child, even though it was dead, because he thought that was an important thing to do. A good part of the American liberal press thought that was a strange thing to do. He was expressing his faith, so that potentially is going to be an issue in the fall if he's the candidate. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was, how did Ronald Reagan become such a popular president? Because he was the last Republican candidate that really controlled the American system effectively. And he did it in a very interesting way. He had something called the Reagan tripod. And the Reagan tripod would be to appeal to social conservatives, to people who didn't feel that things like abortion and issues like that ought to be treated as liberally as they had been. He was conservative on fiscal issues, so he wanted lower tax rates and he wanted less government intrusion. And then he wanted a strong defense. And those were 3 parts of interest in the Republican Party, and he was able to keep those 3 interests all on the same stool, so he was able to get reelected twice. Now, there's some other issues in this campaign that we need to talk about a little bit. Number 1, in this election, more than any prior election, negative campaign tactics have been a feature that I think is going to be very important in the fall. The Romney campaign, and there is no Democratic primary campaign right now because Barack Obama is the only Democratic candidate in this race. So the reason you aren't seeing, as you did in 2008, a Democratic campaign is because Obama's going to be the Democratic nominee. But what's happened in the Republican primaries is that there have been a series of very negative campaign ads against candidates like Herman Cain, against candidates like Rick Perry and other candidates. Gingrich had a raft of them run against him in Florida. And I think at some point, most political consultants believe that negative campaigns work. I don't. I think at some point people are going to say, I'm tired, tell me what you can do, not what my opponent can't do. But most political consultants say you got to go negative because that's the way you win campaigns. So, second issue that is I think an important question. There are fundamental disagreements about what the substance of the key issues of the campaign are. Okay? They talk in different language. They don't even agree on the facts. I have a group on Facebook that is 500 former political campaigners like me, called the Wheel Spinners. Started by a political consultant who worked with Ronald Reagan, but it involves all parts of the political spectrum. And the Wheel Spinners, when we talk about the economy, when we talk about tax policy, when we talk about international policy, it's very hard often for us to speak on the same issue without disagreeing about the facts. So that's a real problem. Third issue, and this is part of 1 and 2, is we've shown an inability to have a civil dialogue. The American system right now, in part because of cable news, in part because of ideological positions of candidates, in part because of negative campaigning, the American political system right now tends to shout a lot, okay? And you don't come to agreement. You don't even come to substantive agreement when people can't talk to each other civilly. I would argue that the Obama health care bill is a perfect example of this. In every other major piece of legislation that has been adopted, certainly in my lifetime in the Congress, there have been at least a token number of opposing people that voted for the bill. In the health care bill, there was not a single Republican who voted for the bill. Okay? And then last but not least, the role of the cable networks. You have CNN, okay? We have CNN, but we have the Fox News channel, we have MSNBC, we have a whole bunch of other, and each of them has a slightly different political twist. The joke during the Clinton administration was CNN was the Clinton News Network, because they always portrayed Bill Clinton positively. Okay? Fox News by the liberals is called faux news, phony news. Okay? MSNBC is referred to by the conservatives as MSLSD, because you have to be on it to listen to what they have to say. So ultimately what happens is, 50 years ago we had 3 networks in the United States, but they mostly covered the same stuff. Now they don't cover the same stuff, so there's no sort of common dialogue. So let me talk about the dangers for this president. Number one, and I would change this order from when I wrote it, but I'm going to go in the order that I put it up. If unemployment, which has started to look like it's coming down, it was at 8% in the last reading, if it doesn't continue to go down substantially, the president will have a hard time getting reelected. Okay? It's a standard. And don't know what the number is that he needs to get it down to, but it needs to continue to go down. And the trend line is in his direction. Number 2, and this came up, this was a self-inflicted wound. 2 weeks ago, the president, through the Department of Health and Human Services, proposed a regulation that would require Catholic charities to offer abortion, contraceptive services, and other things which are against church doctrine. Surprisingly enough, the Catholic establishment, the Congress of Bishops and others, thought that was not a good idea. Surprise. And so the president quickly modified it. The chorus of opposition came up very strongly, and he quickly modified it. And what he said was, now all Catholic and Adventist and other religions that have religious reservations against abortion and contraceptive services and morning after pills and things like that still have to offer health care policies, but they don't have to offer a health care policy that has those services in them. But the insurance carrier who they use to offer the health care policy has to offer them to people who want them. So in essence what happens is the insurance companies then have to pay for those services without getting reimbursed for them. The Catholic bishops, I think wisely, said that's not a good thing. Third problem that the president faces is the euro. Any of you who believe that the euro will be above 130 to the dollar in the next 6 months, I have some land to sell you that is about 600 miles to the west of here. It's got water all around it, and it's very inexpensive. I think that what we are witnessing right now is the deterioration of the European monetary union. And I think that the problem is going to happen regardless of what's done. So I don't believe that the Greek bailout that was just done is going to remain. And if you don't like, if you think the Greek thing will remain, then you still have Portugal, Italy, and Spain to watch out for. So I don't think you can hold the European economic community together, at least in its current format. And if that breaks before late October, I think the president will have some problems, because I think it will cause the rest of the world to go into recession. Last but not least is one that is on every American list every election, and that's the Middle East. It is clear that the Iranians are building nuclear capacity. It is clear that Syria is increasingly destabilized. And it is also clear that there is a large group of Americans who believe that the president was right in pulling us out of Iraq and in pulling us out of Afghanistan. And there is another group that believes that we pulled out too quickly. And if the Middle East begins to deteriorate, the president will not be reelected. So who wins? I will guarantee you, and this is, you can write this down if you want, I will guarantee you that the next president of the United States will be an American citizen. But I think the interesting thing that is happening in this election, more than any election in my lifetime, and I was the child who, when I was very young, when Eisenhower was running for election, so that shows you how long ago it was, in the 50s, I was interested in the election. All my friends were saying, who's on this baseball team or that baseball team? I was saying, who is Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture going to be? Okay? This is the most interesting election in my lifetime. And let me give you 3 things to watch for. Number 1, if by about May, Mitt Romney has locked up the nomination, he needs 1,144 delegates to be voting for him. He now has, I think, 127. If he has locked it up, then you want to look for who his vice presidential running mate will be, and that's going to be very important. Okay? Number 2, if he does not come to that, in other words, if he hasn't locked it up, there's an outside chance that you'll have what's called a brokered convention. That has not happened in my lifetime in either party. And what a brokered convention means is that you get 2,200 Republicans going to Miami in August when it's hot and steamy, trying to choose who their president is going to be, presidential candidate. And that could either be a very positive thing or a very negative thing. The closest thing to that was in 1968 when Hubert Humphrey was nominated for President of the United States after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. And Humphrey went on to lose that election, in part because of the disunity in the Democratic Party. So watch that very carefully. If we have a brokered convention, who knows what's going to happen. Now, third and last thing that you ought to watch for. Watch for September or October. And if you want to understand whether Barack Obama has a chance, don't look at what Barack Obama is saying. Look at whether Mitt Romney has made a positive case as to why he should be president. I don't think he's made that right now. And if he doesn't make it, certainly by the middle of the summer or early September, then he won't be elected.